We're continuing our study on soul prosperity. 3 John verse 2 says, "Beloved, I pray that you prosper in all things and be in health just as your soul prospers." Previous weeks we've been talking about what falls in the parameters of prosperity according to the Word of God. Well, now we're going to move on to just as your soul prospers. So he said, you will prosper in all things and be in health just as your soul prospers. That phrase "just as" in the Greek is the Greek word kathos, and it's something in Greek. It's called a crasis, is where you take two words and it's just like it sounds. You crash them together. You crash those two words together into one word, and it's first of all from kata or kata rather, and it means according to or down, and it speaks of something that has subjected something else. It's something that has brought something down and brought it into subjection. That's the implication of that word. And pos, which is how, like, so that, or as long as. And so when you put those two together, when you put those two words together, you get kathos, and it means according to the manner in which, and in the degree that, or just as. So what does that mean? So in other words, our prosperity is limited, is held down, and it will only manifest according to, in the manner which, or to the degree that our soul prospers. The limitations in our resources in our life are results in the limitations of our soul, not circumstances. It's the soul being, it's to the degree that your soul is uninhibited by poverty thinking and lack thinking, to that degree you're going to prosper, according to this verse, according to what that word means when we unpack it. Jesus said in Luke 4:18, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor." Now, there are some among us, and we talked about in previous lessons, that would think that our number one priority would be feeding the poor or giving resources to the poor. Now, thank God, I believe we should give resources to poor. The Bible teaches we should give resources to the poor. However, Jesus said His number one priority was not giving to the poor, but preaching the gospel to the poor. Why is that? Because poverty and lack is a spiritual problem rather than just a physical problem. So you can't just throw money at a spiritual problem. I've been told that they can actually train fleas. They take fleas and they put them in a container with a lid on it, and they'll jump up several times and hit that lid, and after a while, after hitting their head on that lid for a while, they can take the lid off, and for the rest of that flea's life it'll only jump as high as that limitation you put on it. So in other words, the natural restriction is removed. It's not even the natural restriction holding that flea, limiting that flea's ability, physical ability. It's the limitation in its own mind, a limitation created. Also, I understand that at circuses they have elephants tied. They keep them tied with a rope they could easily break. They just tie a little rope around their leg and tie them down. But the way that they are able to hold them with that rope that they could easily break is when they're a small elephant, they take a chain and they chain them to a pole, and they'll pull against it and pull against it, and eventually they'll stop pulling against it because of the limitation, because of that chain. Well, after they create that mindset in that elephant, then they just put a little rope and the elephant will stop pulling, even though it's a limitation that it could easily break. And see, that's what happens, and that is one of the causes for poverty in people's life. They are held back and limited by limitations in their own mind. A good illustration from church history. There was a segment of professing Christianity throughout church history that if you translated the Bible into a language that the people understood, the leaders of that organization would have you killed and have you murdered. This is professing Christians. Several people were burned at the stake for translating the Bible in the language of a people. Well, in modern times, they can't get away with that. You can't just burn people at the stake for translating the Bible. Yet you talk to somebody from that denomination, and it's like pulling teeth. You can't have a biblical discussion with them because they were trained to not go to the Word for their worldview. They were just taught to do what they were told from the higher ups. So you see, the natural restriction was removed. People even gave their lives and spilled their blood to get the Bible to these people. And yet, because of the limitations put upon them in the past, now the tradition of that group is not to go to the Bible for yourself. It's to just accept what's being told. And also a good example from history, Roger Bannister. In 1954, it was believed that if you ran a mile in under 4 minutes, that you would die. Doctors of that day said if you ran the 4-minute mile, you would die. Well, in 1954, Roger Bannister ran a 4-minute mile. And he collapsed at the end of from exhaustion. He collapsed. And the news reporters even say, yep, see, he's dead. They believe it, but no, he wasn't dead. And in 1955, several people ran the 4-minute mile. And now hundreds do it. Run the mile in under 4 minutes. Well, why didn't they do it before then? Because there was a limitation in their mind, and it took somebody doing it to break that limitation, to get past that limitation. In 1953, Edmund Hillary, who would become Sir Edmund Hillary, climbed Mount Everest. There were several attempts made, and people lost limbs and to frostbite, and several people died trying to climb Mount Everest. However, in 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary did it. And now, people do it all the time. As a matter of fact, businessmen, there's a business in Seattle where you can pay a guy to take you up Mount Everest. And I'm not saying it's easy. You got to train, but the thing is it can be done when several people lost their lives in history trying to do it. There's so many people climbing Everest now that there's a problem with littering. And there's candy wrappers and things on the side of Mount Everest. Well, why wasn't there candy wrappers in 1952? Why was there not all these people climbing? Why was businessmen not climbing it in 1952? Because until somebody did it, there was a limitation in their minds, and it affected their ability to even perform physically. They thought it was physically impossible. In quantum physics, there's some really interesting things, and it's interesting to me that these things are coming out in quantum physics. You had your classic Newtonian physics, and it describes planets and it describes big things. And they used that to get to the moon. However, they couldn't use those theories to describe the way atoms and small things operated. So that then came quantum physics. And quantum physics is the study of these small things, small atoms and things like this. But they did an experiment one time, and they took a piece of metal and they cut 2 slits in it. And they took a little gun and shot marbles through those 2 slits. And they just kind of fired them at random. And some of them bounced off, and some of them went through, and some bounced off this side, and some went through the right, and some went through the left. But eventually, and what they did is they put a thing behind it to see where each one hit that made it through. And as predicted, whenever they made it through, there was 2 bands where all these marbles had hit in the shape of the slits. So you had 2 slits on the measuring device behind it. So then they figured, well, let's try this with waves. So they put the same They put the same two slits down in the water, and they ran waves through this thing. Well, whenever the waves went through the two slits, they broke up and they canceled each other out. And it's not important to, the why isn't important, but the fact is there was multiple bands behind it whenever they put waves through it. Said, well, that's interesting. Why don't we shoot electrons through there? You know, and under the old model of Newtonian physics, electrons were little particles just like the marbles, so they shot those things there, and to their surprise, there wasn't the two bars like the marbles. There was the multiple bands like the waves, and this baffled them. You know, we thought these were particles were shooting through there. So they stuck a camera over the slits to see what's happening to these electrons when they shoot them through there. Well, whenever they put the camera in there and they repeated the experiment, there was two bands again. And what they've determined from this experiment is everything on a molecular level operates at waves of potential. And it's not until we look at them and how we perceive it and how we believe them, they collapse into a certain reality. So according what that experiment proved is what we believe even affects, and how we think affects matter at a molecular level. Wow. You know, and that's the wild thing about quantum physics. And there's a great parallel in Newtonian physics and quantum physics to spirituality. See, under Newtonian physics, they thought we were just actors on a stage. You're in the world and you're just watching the world unfold around you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Yet, what quantum physics teaches us is we're just not just kind of on a stage and everything that happens to us is just happening to us. No, our presence, because we're created in the image of God and because He's given us dominion over the earth, we are changing the world around us based on how we believe. And that's why we have to renew our mind to the Word of God, and we got to prosper in our soul, because we are affecting our outside world. Our outside mirrors our inside. Poverty is a spiritual problem, not a physical one. Consider the nation of India. You know, people want to complicate these things and say, oh, it's just these environmental factors and all these things, and that's why they're poor. Yet, if India was to convert and become a Christian nation tomorrow, they would export beef because they won't eat a cow, because they believe they're sacred. And not only would they export beef, they would export grain because they're feeding all their grain to these cows that they believe are sacred. You know, and there's rats running the streets spreading disease that they won't kill because it might be Uncle Mortimer. So their poverty is not a physical problem, it's a spiritual one. Another example is the notion of primitive people in the earth. The primitive people, and what the evolutionists will tell you is some species are more evolved than other species. You know, and Hitler was really big on these ideas, and that's and that's what led to his goofy ideologies and his hate-filled ideologies, that some races were more evolved than others. But that's what the evolutionists will tell you. You know, the primitive people that are living in poverty are just not as evolved, and the implication is what they are, we once were. And given in time, that someday they will get to where we are. They will evolve more themselves. But let's look at that. Were they just held back by environmental factors? First of all, consider the Lacandon. They're in the Chiapas state in southern Mexico near the Guatemalan border. Now, they have been regarded as some of the most primitive people on earth. I mean, they're living in poverty. They're in darkness, and they worship ancient relics, and in just great darkness. However, modern science, through a study of their language and culture, realize that they're descendants of the mighty Mayan culture. If you haven't heard of the Mayans, the Mayan Empire is thought to have been formed about 1500 BC. The empire rose to prominence between 300 BC and 900 AD. They possessed wonders of architecture, astronomy, and mathematics. They could predict a solar eclipse, which is no small feat, with great accuracy. They used a positional numbering system that's used in modern computers. Something that we take for granted, but they had the zero, which Western civilization didn't discover until the Middle Ages, when it was brought in by the Phoenicians. But at that point, the Mayans had already had it for 1,000 years. They began human sacrifice and disregard for life, and eventually their society crumbled, and they were conquered by Cortez. And so the Lacandon, they're descending rather than ascending, if you study their past. Another group of people is the Quechua in the Andes Mountains in Peru, South America. There's about 5 million of them. Many of them are addicted to cocaine. They just work farms and just stay addicted to cocaine. Some of them just sit on the side of the road and just veg out on cocaine. And they show no vigor for life whatsoever. No desire to excel at all. However, these are descendants of the Incas. The ancient Incas had a vast network of roads greater than those of Rome. Their buildings didn't even require mortar, and they had rooftops of gold, and they're still standing after centuries of being twisted by the earthquakes that plagues that part of the world. They had a complex water system, that many that are still intact. Archaeologists have found evidence of successful brain surgeries. A South American doctor in modern times performed a successful brain surgery using these ancient instruments used by the Incas. Through human sacrifice and inner turmoil, they begin to fight among themselves and strife and all these things. Their society also plummeted. So once again, you see, we're not seeing a group of cave people basically that will someday climb and reach the heights that we have, but rather you see a sophisticated society that declined because of the moral decadence and their spiritual condition. You see this all throughout history. The Egyptian Empire, Babylonian Empire, Phoenicia, Greece, Rome, the Inca, and the Mayan. You'll see a gradual increase, a gradual incline to a great height, and then all of a sudden, because of moral corruption, they sink, they drop. And now a lot of these things are just ruins. A lot of these things are in financial bankruptcy that used to be world empires. So we see from this, it's not, poverty is not an environmental factor, or primarily an environmental factor. See, because environmental factors happen to everyone. You know, an earthquake hit California that was stronger than one in recent history that hit in a Middle Eastern country that didn't believe the Bible. And yet nobody died in California, and a bunch of people died because zoning laws that come from the Old Testament law a lot of our laws come from the Old Testament law. And because we had the Word of God is at the basis of even our civil laws, we put things in place, and not as many people died. So even that, so these things are spiritual problems and not natural problems.